It's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to one of the few politicians I really admire in this country, Vince Cable. Vince, when and where were you born?
I was born in 1943 during the war in York.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up in my first few years of my life in a modest terrace house. And my mother was working in Terry's factory just down the road, packing chocolates. And my father was then working in Rowntree's in a, I think, fairly manual role.
They met through the chocolate connection.
Yes, York was a chocolate city. It smelt of chocolates, and almost everybody was employed making chocolates in some form. And he was beginning his sort of rise through the professions. He was a very ambitious man, and actually when I was a toddler he was studying to teach and eventually became a lecturer in building at the local tech college. But I grew up in my early years where we were in very modest property, and outside loo and inside copper bath and all the rest of it.
Can you go back a little bit on either your mother or father's side to grandparents?
Yes.
Do you remember them at all and what they were like?
I remember my father's mother, who ran a small shop in the area called Layerthorpe, which was a sort of slum area of York. It was the area that was studied by Seaborn Rowntree in his pioneering studies, and she had a small shop there. I can't remember either of my two grandfathers. My maternal grandfather was an interesting man who was a railway man and was one of the founders of the rugby league. But wanted to play sport, rugby league, wanted to be paid, a working guy, and was cut off from rugby union. The code divisions of code and of class. But then he enlisted in the First World War. I think quite a difficult time, as most people had in the First World War. Was captured by the Germans in due course and served his time in a German concentration camp, and emerged with very, very bad health, fuming about the evils of the Germans. And my mother, who emotionally I think I was closer to than my father, used to give me a feel for her upbringing with her grandfather, with my grandfather. And it was it was a working class household, but dominated by rather conservative values. Her father and mother were members of something called the Primrose League, which was active at the beginning of the last century in support of the Conservatives' support for the Boer War, and intensely patriotic and fiercely anti-socialist. She told me that when she was a teenager she'd been out for a date with a local trade unionist who subsequently became leader of the York Labour Party, and she was beaten by her father for this acts of heresy. So both on my mother's side and my father's side there was this strain of kind of working class conservatism that dominated the kind of politics of my early upbringing, which is partly, I suppose, how I became interested in politics. I started arguing with my father and developed a technique for debating when I was, I think, 12, 13 years of age.
What age did you start arguing with your father?
I think I can date it, actually. 13. 1956, Suez. And I just have this memory of my father completely losing his cool, hearing President Nasser on the radio and throwing his slippers at the radio in disgust. And we started arguing, and I got interested in politics. It was the Hungarian Revolution as well, and I remember going to the library and borrowing books about these events. And so by 13 I was becoming quite sort of politicised, but in reaction against the voices I was hearing.
Well, that's an early memory, but what was your earliest memory, the concrete memory?
I think probably when I was, yes, I sort of occasional visual images as a sort of 3-year-old. I remember the 1947 floods. I was then, it was the winter of 47, so I was 3 to 4, and remembering York underwater, you know, walking on planks down by we lived quite near the River Ouse, and the whole city inundated. I think that was my first visual image. And I think, you know, beyond that, just the sort of vague images as a toddler of being walked along the riverside and the smells of the warehouses, because York was then unloading, you know, grain and other products on the Ouse, and it's just the smell, the atmosphere of the place. And I think one of my early memories actually was going out with my mother for a walk down by the river, and her telling me about the York Tower, which is where the Jews of York were burnt alive in I think 12th century, I think. And the sort of imagery of this you know, Holocaust earlier, you know, just stayed with me through childhood.
What was your first school?
It was a place called Poppleton Road Primary School, which was a fairly standard local primary school, very comprehensive, but it was very stratified from the word go. I mean, I think most British primary schools in the late 1940s were like this, that if you were reasonably bright, you were put into a top stream, and there were 4. But I still have vivid memories of the day, I must have been 7 years old, when we were lined up in the playground and into 4 columns, the gradation of what was considered to be academic potential, and I was fortunate enough to be put on to the A stream, and we were carefully segregated from the rest of the school from that point on. And so I was brought up at school, you know, it was a fairly humble school. Most of the parents were workers in the local carriage works, or worked at Terry's Roundtrees or the sugar beet factory. But it was the age of meritocracy, and school was about building up the number of stars you had against your name going across the wall, and very competitive in that kind of way.
Were there any teachers who particularly influenced you at that level?
Yes, I mean, I still remember them, including the top class, Miss Wisely, who they prepared us for the 11 plus. I mean, this whole idea that the 11 plus was some way of identifying innate ability, it struck me even then as being rather phony, because we were very carefully prepared to sit intelligence tests, which, you know, and speed of answering, and it was you know, it was a production line for the future, you know, grammar school elite in the city, which of course we duly became.
Did you did the 11 plus and then went on to grammar school, or?
Yeah, I did. I had it sounds, I'm not trying to be boastful here, but my father told me that I'd actually come top in the whole city in terms of the IQ tests, whatever that means. So I was invited for an interview to Bootham, which was the public school in the city of Quaker, yes, and they offered 1 place a year, and I was paired with another boy to be interviewed. One of the 2 of us was going to go to Bootham. I screwed up the interview. I mean, I don't know. The guy was asking me about works of literature I'd never heard of. I was good at doing tests, but had no depth of intellectual understanding, and obviously was just a mumbling, inarticulate 11-year-old. And the other boy got the place, and I went off to the grammar school, which was good, because in a way I became a big fish in a small pool, rather than.
What was the grammar school?
It was called Nunthorpe Grammar School, which was, you know, fairly standard. These days we call it a bog standard school. You know, in many ways it had high academic standards. It was very, it was very sort of competitive atmosphere. the teachers, there were a kind of generation of grammar school teachers who were very academically very well qualified, but they hadn't been able, I think, to get employment in the 1930s, so they'd gone into teaching. So we did have the benefit of some very capable people. It was a fairly traditional. Corporal punishment was
prefects.
Prefects, yes. I eventually became a prefect and a head boy, and I was a dreadful tyrant.
You were a dreadful tyrant?
I was a bit of a tyrant, yes. I had no standards of order and discipline, but I did agree with the headmaster that we needed to crack down on smoking, so I was an appalling creep. I went around looking around the bike sheds to find people smoking illegally and hauling them up for a beating. So
did you ever beat anyone?
I never. No, the prefects weren't allowed to. It was entirely in the hands of the staff. But that was very much the culture of the place.
Games, a lot of games.
No, I was good at sport. I mean, I suppose one of the academic children sometimes bullied at school. I never was, because I was good at football, good at cricket. So you attract support and friends on the basis of your sporting prowess. So I did both together, the academic and the non-academic.
Were there any teachers there who you particularly?
Yes, there was one in particular. It brings up a slightly embarrassing episode, but there's a man we called him Jimmy Jewell. I think he probably had a more formal name, and who was the leading kind of academic teacher. Taught us history till O level, and then I went on to do science. But I'd come to his attention, and we were put into a class just called the remove, where we sort of bypassed O levels to prepare for more advanced studies. And I was, I guess, one of the more forceful members of his class. And at one point, I repeated some kind of racial prejudices from home, because my dad had quite a few attitudes, including about Jewish people. So I repeated this appalling anti-Semitic slur, and then somebody pointed out to me after the class that Mr. Jewell was Jewish, but he hadn't said anything to me at the time. Anyway, I realised I'd committed some awful, unforgivable faux pas, but it never went any further. But then a few months later, we had auditioned for the school play, and it was a joint exercise with the local girls' grammar school, and I was not expecting to do anything. I wasn't particularly articulate. I used to hide in the back row to avoid having to do stuff. But in the auditions, Mr. Jewell, who was in charge of this process, sort of picked me out and gave me the lead role.
Shylock?
As Macbeth. Not a Shylock, Macbeth. And he obviously saw something in me and forgave the earlier slur. And invested quite heavily in me, actually. And I wouldn't claim I ever became Laurence Olivier, but I did learn to perform in a public space and to declaim and speak reasonably good Shakespearean prose, and to act. So I think in terms of personal development, that probably did more for me than anything I ever did at school. And he was more responsible than anybody else, and it had given me the confidence that when I came up to university, that to get involved in the union and politics and being able to stand up and say things which I hitherto would never have dreamt of doing.
Did you do any political activity at school?
A little bit, yes. I had two very, very good friends. One of whom was the son of a Daily Telegraph reading conservative, and the other which was a communist. His father was a shop steward in the York Carriage Works, and I very much fell under his influence. I didn't buy his politics, but I was very drawn to him. he was an extraordinary character who, aged 15, 16, was a very talented artist, and he'd somehow managed to get his teenage girlfriends to appear in the nude for him, which I had a great admiration for, and built his own racing cars and out of polystyrene. I'm not sure what it was, but anyways, it was an incredibly gifted guy, but totally wayward. He subsequently went off to art school, and in an act of revolutionary zeal, I think burnt it down, or was there some revolutionary act. I met this guy actually about a year ago. We had we met up again after 50 years, over 50 years, and he has become a celebrated artist in the north of England. He's thought of as the sort of Turner of the North. He does this style of landscaping. And was still winning hill climbs in his homemade racing cars. So, no, he's still there, very much as I knew him. But he had a great influence on me. And he asked me, he stood as a communist candidate in the school election in 1959, and he asked me to be his agent. And I said, well, I didn't agree with him, but I would be his agent. But then he was barred by the headmaster from standing, who said that we're not going to have communist candidates in this school. So, I then got behind the Liberal. My mother had always told me that, in private, that she never argued publicly in front of me with my father about politics. But she obviously disliked my father's very hard right-wing views, and said that in the privacy of the polling booth, although she'd been instructed to vote Conservative, she did actually vote for the Liberals. So I thought this was a sensible middle road position, and in that school election, I signed up and was an active supporter of the Liberal candidate. Of course, came a bad third, as you do. There was a kind of stirring of political activity, but in my case, it was mostly a reaction against the kind of extremes. My father's at home was very right wing, very in favour of the empire, and stamping on all this. Communists like Jomo Kenyatta, who were destroying the British Empire, and then my communist friend, who I intensely admired but didn't agree with. So I found some comfort in the kind of middle way, even at 16.
Very, very interesting. What about religion? York is quite a Quaker sort of place.
Yes, well, I encountered the Quakers, but I had a very kind of eclectic kind of religious approach, because I was brought up in the Baptists, and my father, I think he trained to be a Baptist pastor at some point, but then dropped out. But my parents took me along to Baptist Sunday school. They suddenly stopped going for reasons that I think had to do with church politics. I never quite understood. And after dropping out of the Baptists, I went along to the Methodists, who were at the end of the road. Had a good Cub Scout division, which I joined. So I signed the Temperance Pledge, as you do, as a fully aware 11-year-old. And that kept me going for a few years. And then, I think mid-teens, I was chasing after a rather nice-looking young woman, and she introduced me to the Society of Friends. So I pursued her to the Society of Friends, and was a kind of Quaker attender for several years. But it wasn't in here. I mean, I was going for the wrong reasons. I mean, I liked the people and I admired them, but I didn't have any great religious conviction. And in fact, in my last year at school, I had this feeling, which probably a lot of us have, that there must be something in this religion thing, but I didn't know what it was, and I'd never felt anything particularly. So I made a point of going round all the denominations in York, and there were quite a lot of them, Christadelphians and Elim and these weird sects, and Jehovah's Witness, I went to the Mormons just to try them out and see what they had to say. But they were sort of very bizarre, most of them, and nothing grabbed me. So that was the end of my religious exploration until, I suppose, later in my university life. We'll go into this in due course, but I was in a vacation and met this lovely woman from Kenya. We were both nursing at the Retreat Mental Hospital in York as a vacation job, and well, it's a complicated story, but I fell in love. We duly got married, and she was a Catholic, so I got introduced to Catholicism. But she was actually a rebel Catholic who very strongly objected to church teaching on birth control and abortion and so on. So she fell out with the church. I'd just gone along with it to please my new wife. So that was the last encounter, really. And then I suppose in adult life, I sort of made friends with the local church around the corner. My 3 children are all baptised and confirmed in the Church of England, though I don't think any of them go. 2 of them are married Catholics, but I don't think it's terribly deep. And I when I was an MP, I used to enjoy going along to civic services, but it wasn't spiritual, and I've never been spiritual. And my eldest son is a Buddhist, so it may say something about the eclecticism that developed in my household.
Very interesting. So you went into the science sixth forms.
Yes.
What was your particular subject that you enjoyed?
Well, it was the sort of maths, physics, chemistry. I mean, I did it for the wrong reasons. I probably should have done history, geography, Latin, which I was good at and enjoyed. But my dad had a very practical view of the world, that you have to get a job at some point, and nobody is interested in arty-farty art subjects.
Yes.
You can become a lawyer or a accountant, which are respectable professions, or more likely you should become a scientist and engineer, because there's lots of jobs. So I was encouraged to do science A level. I wasn't particularly brilliant or particularly good at it, but I did well enough to get into here.
Yes, that's the next stage. How is it that you ended up in Cambridge reading economics?
Well, I came here to do natural science, actually. My first 2 years here were natural science. And it was, I think it owed a lot to the school. It's obviously, as I've described earlier, it was a very meritocratic institution, and the small group of pupils who were considered, quote, Oxbridge material were very carefully nurtured, and I was one of them. So even though I wasn't, passionately interested or very good at my science subjects, I was given enough support and encouragement to get through the entrance process.
Why Cambridge?
Well, I think entirely for prestige and snobbish reason. I had no connection with the place. It was just considered the top of the tree, really. And if you were a scientist, Cambridge rather than Oxford. So.
And you went to Pembroke?
No, I was at Fitzwilliam, yes, which I think was my second or third choice, but they took me, so I was grateful for that. And I came up here to do natural science.
What was that like?
Well, I treated it in a fairly unprofessional way, really, because I hated laboratories. I mean, I was used to mess up experiments and spill acid and things like this. I was absolutely hopeless at the practical side of it. I loved the theory, but I hated the practical side of it. So I didn't take the course as seriously as I should have done as an academic. But I tried to do as many varied options as possible, and the Cambridge Natural Science Tripos is miraculously wide subject area. I finished up doing philosophy of science, psychology, geology. I did metallurgy. I did as many things as options as I possibly could, just a bit of interest. And so I had, it was really interesting to you. That wasn't very brilliant, and I was pursuing an entirely unfocused approach to the science curriculum, but yeah, it was intellectually nourishing, and I enjoyed doing it. But I had no intention of staying with it. I just wanted to change over to something else, and economics was what I was really interested in.
Why did you change to economics?
Well, it was the closest subject Cambridge could offer to what you could loosely call public policy, politics. They didn't have a politics course here. It's probably a good thing. So it was concerned with policy work, and I was moderately competent at maths, so I could cope with the abstractions of the economic course. So as soon as I could, I sort of bolted, and
you spent 1 year.
I did 2 years actually,
2 years,
natural science, and then switched.
And 2 years economics, or?
Yes, I did actually. I indulged an extra year, and part of the reason was that I was spending a lot of time in university politics. I was active in the union. I became president eventually, and so I was spending an awful lot of time on my side activities and getting involved with passionate love affairs and things of this kind, which good students are not supposed to do.
And acting at all?
I did actually. I thought there was something I needed to do, so I remember a production of Joan of Arc, which I was involved in, and several other plays. I mean, I wasn't a great actor, but I just enjoyed the theatre, and I think probably it's the theatre side of politics that drew me into the political life, actually.
Were there any teachers, either in the first 2 years or last 2 years, who influenced you a lot?
Oh yes, there were. I think on the natural science tripos, there was a man called Harland who taught geology and was a magnificent lecturer, and geology can be a very dry subject, but he brought out the dynamics of continental drift and made this whole subject sort of come alive, and you realise that the gift of being able to communicate, and even the dry subject, and he had quite a he kept alive my interest in science. Then when I did economics, I mean, I was very privileged. I mean, I was lectured at by all the greats of Cambridge, John Robertson, Kahn, Caldor, Posner, Leisner, all the really, they were at that time, well, I came here as undergraduate in the 62, these were the people who were the kind of main intellectual inspiration behind Harold Wilson was beginning his rise to the top, and there was this appetite for a new kind of economic policy that was much more engaged, and economic planning based on French ideas. And the staff at Cambridge in the Keynesian tradition were very much the driving force actually in the country, not just in the university. I mean, Cambridge has ceased to have that kind of role, but then you felt slightly intoxicated. There was Posner and people like that. They would be up working on George Brown's 5-year plan in the morning and coming to lectures in the afternoon. So it was that sense of engagement with people who were not just incredibly bright, but were actually highly influential. And I think probably the most important was James Mead, who was Nobel Prize, and it was a really great. I mean, he's a very dry stick, and his lectures were terribly boring. But we knew he was rather special, and he had a sideline in writing more accessible books. I think he did a book on the Radical's Guide, the Sensible Radical's Guide to Economics, or something that anybody could understand. So these people had a big influence.
It's rather nice. We're doing this interview in Lord Richard Kahn's rooms, where he lived for some 10-15 years in his rooms, and the King's was obviously associated with a lot of the figures you mentioned. So when you finished your tripos, you got a reasonable degree, and then what did you do?
Well, I saw an advertisement one day in the Sidgwick building for something called an ODI Nuffield Fellowship, where they were advertising for, I think, 6 young people a year to go out to Africa to work as economists in newly independent African countries. And it was sufficiently interesting and exotic and fitted my interest at the time. I just decided to go for it, and it was highly competitive, but I got one of the 6 fellowships and went out to work for Jomo Kenyatta's government in the finance ministry, which was in a way ludicrous. I mean, I was only 21, 22, had just done half a degree, really, a full economics degree, and I was suddenly plunged into making, as a senior, middle-level civil servant, doing fairly responsible things without any background or any training. I mean, it was rather presumptuous, as one or two of my African colleagues pointed out, but nonetheless it was filling a hole that had been left by all these expatriates who, of course, just left at independence, and the new generation of African graduates from Macfarlane and so on hadn't yet come through the system. So we were performing a useful role, and it was a real kind of university of life experience. Yeah.
Did you enjoy it?
Oh yes, I enormously enjoyed it, and quite apart from anything else, my Kenya girlfriend that I'd met in York happened to live in Nairobi, a happy coincidence, so I met up with her, and we duly got married. It was quite an adventure, because my father was appalled that I was marrying this, quote, coloured woman, and decided to cut me off, and her father was equally outraged, because they'd arranged, not in a formal Indian sense, but in a looser Goan sense, a suitable boy, and here was the daughter disobeying the family and going off to marry this white man with uncertain prospects. So we had problems on both sides, but anyway we decided to ignore them and just get married, and indeed we lived happily ever after. So she sadly died of cancer.
Lovely. How long did you stay there?
I was there, I think, 2.5 years, something like that. I left pretty much on the day that Tom Mboya was assassinated, in a rather dramatic style. And it was also the period when the Kenyan nation exodus was happening in Kenya. It wasn't like Uganda, where people were physically driven out, but the Kenyan government was telling Asians who didn't have Kenyan passports that they should prepare to leave and go back to their mother country, i.e. Britain. So my sort of departure from Kenya was with my wife. I mean, she was becoming a refugee. I mean, had she not been married to me, she would have been a nomad.
Why was that? She was Asian?
Yeah, she was Asian with
a
British subject.
I see. Right. So you left and went where and did what?
Well, I applied for various jobs in British universities and finished up in Glasgow. I was offered a lectureship, again, the kind of thing you can't do these days. You have to do PhDs.
24, 25.
Yes, no, it was ridiculous. I think it wasn't a reflection on my ability, it was a reflection on the supply and demand in the market for young economic lecturers. So I finished up in the Adam Smith building in Glasgow, teaching economics. And some of the future stars of Scottish politics, were my students.
Tom Smith?
He was slightly ahead of me, actually. sorry, there's a name here that's just
Well,
gone.
we can fill it in later, yes.
Yeah, but this sort of ferocious interviewer who was actually one of my pupils, and he sort of used to remind me whenever he interviewed me that he'd been taught economics by me, and then proceeded to put me in my place.
Paxman.
Not Paxman, he's still going strong. Scottish, Murdoch's former editor.
Oh yes, I know. Yeah.
Andrew Neil.
Yeah.
That was kept me going. And the project I embarked upon when I was in Glasgow as a sort of research project was on Latin America. There was a sort of fashion for economic integration in developing countries following the model of the European Union, and the Latin American countries were trying it. And so I embarked on a research project looking at the Latin American experience of economic integration, particularly Central America, as Panama up to Mexico, and spent several years in the middle of my teaching writing a PhD, which was a useless waste of time. I mean, I acquired this enormous volume which only 3 people in the world I think have ever read.
You and the 2 examiners.
Yes, exactly.
And then, how did you go on from there? Well, I just want to ask you about, you were in the Adam Smith building. I've written a small book on Adam Smith and have a great regard for him. What were your feelings about?
No, I'm a great fan of Adam Smith, and I still, not just as an economist, but because he wrote 2 volumes, he didn't just write Wealth of Nations, and his work showed the sort of depth of understanding of political economy, and that economics has to engage with the kind of moral precepts that society has. And this was probably the first economic thinker who had, well, first of all, set out some of the basic principles around the way economists functions, but also understood the wider political and philosophical concepts. So Adam Smith was one of the all-time greats. But there was a certain irony, because although I was, that was my job, researching and teaching, I'd got involved in Glasgow politics. I'd stood for Parliament, and then I got elected to Glasgow City Council, which was in the beginning of the 1970s, a rather rum organisation. The Labour group had it was a kind of Tammany Hall machine in many ways, and quite why they allowed me in, I don't know, but anyway, I got in as a Glasgow City Councillor, and I was spending really sort of 80% of my time in Glasgow politics rather than university economics. But it was incredible grounding, and actually I managed to achieve quite a lot in 3 years on the council. But anyway, they got to a point where I had to decide what I was going to do with my life. I'd fallen out very badly with some of the people in the local mafia. I'd turned down a planning application from some rather powerful individual I wasn't supposed to cross, and then publicly denounced him, which had me threatened with libel, and the whole thing was very messy. So I basically decided to move away from Glasgow, do something totally different, move away from the politics and the economics, and I was offered a job in the diplomatic service. By then I knew quite a lot about Latin America. I'd been researching it for a couple of years, and they wanted outsiders who could contribute something to our foreign policy, so I was brought in as a first secretary in the diplomatic service.
And you stayed in the civil service for quite a while?
Yes, 2 to 3 years, and I basically, as I put it, I had the Aztec, Inca, and Maya empires. That was my beat in the Foreign Office, plus Cuba. And Cuba was especially interesting because it was under Castro. They were beginning to become more assertive, and they got involved in the Angola War. So that drew me into the whole world of intelligence and getting to know the people who dealt with international security issues. It made my job much more fascinating than what I had been doing, which was basically selling things to Venezuela and Mexico, and particularly armaments. But so I saw the way that geopolitics and geoeconomics actually operated at that stage. It was a great insight into the workings of government, which was enormously helpful to me later.
Because you then, if we move on to your political career, you stood for Parliament a number of times, but
yes,
were finally elected. When was that?
97, which was 30 years after I'd first stood. At the fifth attempt, I'd two attempts in the 80s. I'd come from York, as I mentioned, and I was caught up in I had been in the Labour Party. I was a Labour councillor in Glasgow. I got caught up in the Civil War in the Labour Party in the early 80s, Jenkins and the Gang of Four and all that kind of thing. So I became SDP, and the SDP gave me a chance to stand for the Liberal Alliance, SDP Liberal Alliance in York, which was then thought to be a winnable seat. It was a delusion, but anyway, I spent 5 years of my life going backwards and forwards to York, trying to get elected and failing, and relying very heavily on the patience of my family, and trying to do a job in the meantime.
The job you were doing was still...
Well, I did all kind of things, actually. I went for a while to a think tank called the Overseas Development Institute, and directed their research, trade policy. I had
That wasn't a thing at Sussex?
No, the ODI is a much bigger organisation, actually, based in London. The IDS is the sort of pure academic, and ODI is a think tank, what you call a think tank. I then had a stretch working for John Smith. That was before I left for the SDP, was his special advisor in the dying days of the Labour government, the Callaghan government, which was again an amazing experience. And then I went off to work for an organisation called the Commonwealth Secretariat under a man called Sonny Ramphal, who was, again, it was a real eye-opening experience.
Very wide experience you've had. At what point did you work for Shell?
Well, I'd been at the Commonwealth Secretariat for a few years, and one of the projects that Sonny Ramphal had got me involved in was something called the Brundtland Commission, which was the United Nations Commission looking at the interrelationship between economic development and the environment, which was then not a very fashionable subject. But the Commission came up with this concept of sustainable development, and I was really in the middle of all that research and debate and drafting, and that in turn led to some work with scientists on global warming. This was the mid-80s. It hadn't been, it wasn't very few people had cottoned on to the fact there was an issue here. But the president of the Maldives had read this in a newspaper somewhere and was worried that his island was going to be swamped in rising sea level, so he commissioned a study into global warming and sea level rise, and I was asked to conduct it, and did so, and this was 87, 88, something like that. And then Shell were also becoming concerned, as you'd expect a fossil fuel company, and they were trying to beef up their capacity for thinking about these problems. So I was brought in to the planning department, and spent several years there, very productive years. I was involved in a team that did Shell scenario planning, which is a way of thinking about the future, which is unique and very productive. Started working on environmental issues, but then in turn they got me looking at scenarios around the future of some of the countries that Shell was either having trouble with like Nigeria, or wanted to make a long-term commitment to, i.e. Russia at the time of Yeltsin's fall, India, and most of all China. So I was asked to conduct the China scenarios for Shell. It took a fair bit of time working with the Shell people in China, mostly in Hong Kong, and with London, trying to think through what it would mean if Shell made a major commitment to China. And so that was the beginnings of my interest in China.
What year was it that you first went to China?
It would be 90, 94, 95, something like that. The Shell was considering making a major investment in a petrochemical complex called Nanhai in Guangdong province. It was highly controversial in the company because it was potentially vast, and the outlook of the company was still very much European. China was a sort of slightly dodgy place, not the place that executives were very comfortable with. But I suppose I contributed to the thinking which saw China in terms of its economic prospects, and we had a scenario that was thought to be completely bonkers at the time. Just imagine if China grows at 8% for the next 3 decades, it will have an economy roughly as big as the United States. People thought this was just completely off the wall, but of course it's what's happened. And that fed into the kind of planning assumptions about this project and Chinese development generally.
China is obviously something that particularly interests me and many of the viewers. How many times have you been to China?
Not many, actually.
To mainland China?
I've been to, I think, on the Shell exercise, I went 2 or 3 times, short visits. I went twice, 3 times as a minister. That's the sum total of it. All of them short sort of business visits. But I got a flavour of the sort of dynamism of the place.
And what do you like about China? Because you've argued.
Well, I'd spent much of my writings dealing with the problem of development. That was what had really grabbed me when I was an economics student here, and then working in Africa, Latin America, did a lot of work in India. You're just grappling with this problem as how do countries break through from being very poor to developed. What does it take? And as you know, experience has not been kind to many countries. They've sort of drifted into, have either gone backwards or stagnated. And China was one of the few countries, together with the small, newly industrialized countries like Korea and Taiwan, which seem to have made it, but on a mega scale. How have they done it? It's just extraordinary. So that was what drew me in initially. It was primarily seeing it from the standpoint of an economic approach rather than a cultural approach. I didn't speak the language, still don't, so I wasn't penetrating very deep, but I began to get a sort of picture of this, the extraordinary way in which this vast country had managed to sort of lift itself, and that in turn got me interested in the politics and the economics of Deng Xiaoping and his predecessor and how they got there, and what was it that made economic policy in China. So that was my entree. That was the things that got me interested.
So if you had to name 3 or 4 factors which you think are of central importance in understanding how China has made this extraordinary breakthrough, what would they be?
Well, I think it's this combination of having a framework of order with making use of entrepreneurial energy and economic policy that is conducive to entrepreneurship and business, the combination of those two things. And they, before the late 70s, of course, the balance was horribly wrong and they'd done great harm. But Deng, who I would regard as one of the great figures in modern history, somehow or other, an ex-soldier, a commissar, not anybody who ever studied economics or been in business, sort of knew what had to be done, and also understood the potential for the peasant population, given stability and land rights and incentives, to deliver enormous amounts. So I think you asked me what are the key factors. One is getting that balance between a strong state and the use of markets. I guess another is a capacity for making sustained large-scale investment. And I suppose the third is engaging with the outside world, which was modern China, at least until very recently, has been very good at doing. Learning about the technologies, learning the way of thinking about the Western world, not losing their sense of identity and their own sense of destiny, but making use of engagement with the Western world. So that combination of things, market socialism, state and market, deep investment, selective use of engagement with the outside world. Those are the elements. I mean, there are others, but they seem to be key.
This is a chance for a plug for your newish book on China. Remind me of the title of your book.
Well, I did a shortish pamphlet called China Engage, but that wasn't serious. I think the serious book was called The Chinese Conundrum, which was not trying to interpret China looked at from within, because I don't have that background knowledge of the language, but it's essentially about how I think the West, and Britain in particular, should deal with China, because we have a range of options, an increasingly confrontational view that they have to be contained, ranging right across to complete indifference to what happens in China. But I always took the word from the very beginning, and it goes back to that involvement in Shell, that this is a massively important, significant country. We have to understand it, we have to deal with it, we have to be constructive, we have to try to understand where it's coming from historically and in other ways, and that there are potentially great benefits to the West from engagement, not from confrontation. And those benefits are partly economic, but they're partly recognising that there are what economists call public goods, whether it's dealing with common problems like in global warming or pandemic management, or helping third world countries deal with their debts or whatever. These issues will never be dealt with unless we work with the Chinese about them.
Well, coming back to what you're best known as, which is a politician and leader of the Lib Dems for a while, we've had a rough period in British politics fairly recently, and many people wondered whether secretly Liz Truss was going back to her earlier roots as a Lib Dem and promoting it by making such a mess of things. What's your feeling about the future of the Lib Dems now in this difficult circumstances?
Well, it's the immediate future is not greatly different from when I came in. I got elected in '97. Paddy Ashdown was the leader. we just doubled our number of MPs to get 46 or something of that kind, and there was a unpopular Tory government. Labour there was a sort of end of an epoch, and we to some extent came in on the back of that. A lot of tactical voting in places like Twickenham. Anybody who wasn't Tory, we encouraged to vote Lib Dem, and I got elected. A lot of people were genuine Lib Dem supporters, but a lot of them were Labour, and I got elected to Parliament on the back of that. And my first 10 years or so in Parliament were, I was just learning to be a backbench MP and doing odd interesting things. But the big transformation occurred in the Lib Dems prospects with the coalition government. I was heavily involved in it. I was Nick Clegg's deputy, and in the coalition I became Secretary of State for Business, Innovation, Skills, which was universities, colleges, and so on. And those 5 years, in a sense, the most important period of my life, personally and politically. Considerable achievement, but unfortunately the Lib Dems have been sort of rather airbrushed out of history, and the things that we genuinely did that were positive have been forgotten, and we've been the bad things of the coalition era have been largely hung around our neck. 2015 the party almost died. I lost my seat, did almost all my colleagues, but then 2 years later I was back, and I was immediately appointed leader because nobody else wanted to do it, and so the job of trying to get the breathe life into the corpse of a party that had almost died, and we made good progress on local government, European elections. The prospect looked very bright. I felt the time had come to retire, step down, hand over to the younger generation. Unfortunately, mixture of bad luck and bad judgment, we had another bad election 2019. We were back to a corpse that was just slightly breathing. And my successor, Ed Davey, is trying to trying to continue where I took off, which is getting the party back to a competitive state. I think that's happening. It's happening slowly, mainly through local government and by-elections, but there is a reasonable prospect, I think, that a scenario a little like 1997 will happen again, and we will get back with 30 to 40 possibly MPs on the strength of an anti-conservative swing. What then happens to the Lib Dems in that situation, I don't know. It partly depends how big the Labour victory is. We may no longer be relevant, but if they do need our support, then the way potentially is open to changes in the voting system, and that creates a fundamentally different environment to operate in as a smallish political party.
Because you've always been in favour of proportional representation.
Yes. I think not just because it's in the interests of the Lib Dems and the Greens and other small parties, but I think it takes us more in the direction of sensible government of the kind they've got in Germany and many European countries.
So we've just got 3 or 4 more minutes. Was there anything you would have liked to have talked about that I haven't?
No, we've covered the ground quite extensively. I think you'd wanted to concentrate on the early years, but we've drifted on.
I was just going to ask you then what you're doing now and what your plans were.
Well, I'm now a retired politician, but I'm not retired sort of mentally, and the retirement is a banned word in my house. But so I'm doing various things. I've got in universities. I've got a visiting professorship at the LSE and at Nottingham, and I do odd things for them. I've been writing books, including a book on China, but the book that is now doing quite well, I think, is a semi-satirical book called How to Be a Politician. And then I'm here in Cambridge today to talk to students about it. And in addition, I'm involved in business. I'm with a company that is trying to develop infrastructure for hydrogen in road transport. We're doing very well. And I, amuse myself in all kinds of dancing competitions and
Dancing?
yes.
You dance or you?
Yes, no, I do. I've been doing it for many years. I got onto Strictly on one occasion, at least for their Christmas show. So yeah, I take it seriously. Do training and compete.
Wonderful. Well, that's a lovely cheerful note to end on. So
Okay.
thank you very much indeed, Vince.
Okay, thank you.